So a few of my friends have been asking, will they ever get a formal diagnosis for autism? And my answer is a strong and resounding no. My reasons for this are many, and you'll never ever hear any of those reasons on any other video on YouTube. So stick with me till the end, guys, because I promise you, after you've heard what I had to say, you'll be questioning everything you thought you knew about autism and what it means to be on the spectrum. Hi guys, Simon Winovich here. Everyone just calls me Simo. Welcome to the Ultimate Divergence Embracing Neurodiversity YouTube channel. Are you struggling with life on the autism spectrum? Are you open to or currently engaged in spiritual practices? Do you feel disconnected from traditional therapeutic methods for treating autism? If so, you're in the right place, because it's here where we deal with everything neurodivergent and we teach you how to become an ultimate divergent. So I never realised I was on the spectrum until the age of 50. I began to suspect around the age of 40, but due to early childhood experiences, I had a huge problem with the idea of mental health labels. However, by the time I got to 50 years old, I was getting so many messages from the universe that I needed to look into this. I jumped online and I did the online autism quotient test, the empathy quotient test, and the systemizing quotient test. And all three came back saying it was highly likely that I was on the spectrum. So immediately I joined a heap of Facebook autism and Asperger's groups and instantly recognised my tribe. After feeling like an alien from another planet all my life, here I was all of a sudden surrounded by people just like me. Now, I fully get when people say they get this huge sense of relief when they're diagnosed with autism at a later age in life. I got that same sense of relief earlier in my late 30s, but for a different reason. I was working on a coal mine and the owners of the mine decided to put everybody through a personality test. And the idea was they wanted to balance up the crews personality-wise on the theory that it would increase production. So they put us all through the test and the results came back in a personality wheel. And I think there was about 12 personality subsets, I think. The bulk of the workforce was all grouped on one side in about 3 personality categories. And here I was completely on the opposite side on my own. And in that instant, I got that same sense of relief. Now, it wasn't because of the label, because my personality type was called Innovator Creator. And I'd never heard of that before, so I had no emotional attachment to that word at all. So that's not what gave me the sense of relief. What gave me the sense of relief was realising that that difference I had felt all my life wasn't something that I just imagined in my head. It was measurable, it was quantifiable. So I get that feeling that people get when they finally get diagnosed. But personally, I don't identify as being autistic and I don't identify as having Asperger's. I choose to define myself as an extreme neural divergent with a predominantly systemizing cognitive style. Now, my reasons for not wanting to get a clinical assessment are many, and the best way to begin explaining them is to just start with the AQ test. So the online autism quotient test, or AQ test, is a set of 50 statements. For example, the first one is, I prefer to do things on my own rather than with other people. Now, for each one of these statements, there is a set of 4 multiple choice answers. And those answers are exactly the same for each one of the statements. And those answers are definitely agree, slightly disagree, definitely disagree. Now, the score is out of 50, and I don't know exactly how they're scoring it behind the scenes. But let's say you get 1 point for one answer, 2 points for the next answer, 3 points for the next, and 4 points for the next. That gives you a possible score out of 200, and then they would just divide that by 4 to give you a score out of 50. Now, if you were to go to your doctor and say, hey, look, doc, I suspect I might be autistic, or if he suspected you might be autistic, this is the test he would give you. And then depending on your score, would determine whether he would refer you to get a clinical assessment. Most non-autistic males score around 17 on this test and women score around 15. Now, a score of 26 or higher indicates that you may be autistic. Think of the scores between 26 to 50 as each step is increasing your chances of being autistic. At 25, you have a 0% chance of being autistic. At 26, you have a 24% chance of being autistic. At 31, you have a 75% chance of being autistic. At 32, you have an 80% chance of being autistic. At 34, which is where I score at, you have an 88% chance of being autistic. 47, you have a 99% chance of being autistic. And at 50, you have a 100% chance of being autistic. Now, I want to point out here what this is actually pointing out. This test goes hand in hand with the clinical assessment. So rather than pointing out that you are autistic, it's pointing out the likelihood that you will be clinically diagnosed as being autistic. And there's an important distinction here that I'll show you as we go along. So once you've done the tests, it states at the end, do not take these results as definitive. And they recommend, if you score 26 or above, they recommend you get a clinical assessment. The reason for that is because of the subjectivity of the scoring, in that you are assessing yourself, your own behaviours, and scoring them. And subjectivity means that it's basically your opinion of your behaviours, so you're subject to your own cognitive biases. Whereas objectivity, it's like when you go and get a blood pressure test. They put the machine on you and it comes back with a reading. It's a definitive reading saying exactly what's happened there. So that is an objective assessment. Now, on top of that, because there's only 4 multiple choice answers, a lot of times when you answer them, you sort of get stuck, slightly agree or slightly disagree. I really feel I'm in the middle, but I can't choose the middle. So either one you choose doesn't feel right, but you've got to choose one. And that can change from day to day too, how you feel. One day you could say slightly agree, the next day you say slightly disagree. Because of that, that's why they recommend a clinical assessment. And the clinicians, they're the professionals, they know their stuff right. So you can't argue with that. If I wanted to really know, why wouldn't I go and get a clinical assessment? But for what I'm about to explain to you now, you'll fully understand why I don't want to go anywhere near it. So we need to point out that there are no reliable biomarkers for diagnosing autism, in that you can't get a blood test, you can't get a scan. There are no physical tests you can take that will establish whether you have autism or not. A diagnosis of autism relies solely upon the observation and assessment of behaviour. Now, at the moment, there's just this mass delusionment overtaking the world that autism is caused by genetics. You have so-called reputable information sites on autism emphatically stating that autism is genetically caused. And this is further magnified by autism influencers all over YouTube, emphatically saying that autism is genetically caused. Now, the fact is that has not been conclusively proven. So guys, if you're liking what you see so far in this video, hit that subscribe button, give that notification bell a bit of a nudge so you'll know when my next video comes out. Give us a like because you help out my channel, and feel free to leave a comment below this video because your feedback is invaluable to me. So if you go to the National Institute of Mental Health website, they're a sub-department of the National Institute of Health, which is the largest medical research facility in the world. Now, if everybody believes that autism is genetically caused, we should be able to go to this website and they will emphatically say autism is genetically caused. Now, this is a direct quote from their website. Researchers don't know the primary cause of ASD. Now they go on to say, but studies suggest, they just suggest, they don't conclusively prove, the studies just suggest that a person's genes can act together, might act together, but not necessarily do so. It's just a possibility that they can act together, with aspects of the environment to affect development in ways that lead to ASD. They don't say that cause ASD, they just lead to ASD. So that single sentence clearly states that they do not know the cause of autism, and that studies only suggest that genetics may play a role in causing autism. Yet we have all these so-called authority websites on autism clearly stating that autism is genetically caused, and you have all these YouTube influencers stating that it's genetically caused. So, of course, you now have the world population tending to believe that autism is genetically caused. In a future video, I'll go in further into this, why this is happening, what's causing this. But for now, just know that when they state we have strong supporting evidence to suggest that autism is genetically caused, don't take that on as an absolute belief that yes, it's genetically caused, because evidence is not proof. Evidence is just a clue that something may be true, whereas proof is absolute. It's conclusive. It's without a doubt that thing is true. Evidence is just correlation, and correlation is not causation. Now, correlation is just when two things move together according to a certain circumstance. Say in summertime, drownings go up and ice cream consumption goes up. So that's a correlation. You have ice cream consumption and drownings moving together. But from that you cannot conclude causation, whereby you can't say therefore high ice cream consumption causes drownings. Well, this is what people are trying to do with genetic cause for autism. The genetic factors that they've identified are only present in some cases of autism, but not all of them. So it's just a correlation, but there's no way of showing causation. They can't, therefore, just because these genes are present in some of these cases, they can't therefore say, oh, genes must be causal. At best, all they can say about genetics regarding autism with the evidence they have so far is that genetics may play a part in either influencing or causing autism when it is present, but it doesn't need to be present for autism to occur. That's all that can honestly be said at this stage about genetics and autism. So back to diagnosis. Because there are no biological tests to conclusively show whether you're autistic or not, diagnosis relies solely upon the subjective observation of behaviour and interpretation of that behaviour. So when I was at university studying Bachelor of Psychology, one of the things I noticed, now this wasn't across the board, not everybody had this, but some of these psychologists, they had this like holier than thou attitude that because they were studying the mind, they were smarter than everybody else. And I've seen this in various interviews where psychologists or psychiatrists have been interviewed. And one I saw emphatically state, because of their training, psychiatrists were highly objective in their clinical assessments for mental health diagnosis. Nobody is immune from subjectivity. Everybody has cognitive biases. Now, I would argue that clinicians are more susceptible to cognitive biases. And there's two experiments that exemplifies this. The first was Rosenham's experiment conducted by psychologist David Rosenham in the early 1970s. Now, he and a bunch of his team members, I think there was 20, don't quote me on the number, they went to a psychiatrist and they all feigned having auditory hallucinations. They were hearing voices. They were all committed as schizophrenics, with one being committed as being bipolar. Now, as soon as they got into the mental health ward, they stopped pretending to have these auditory hallucinations and started telling the guards and doctors and nurses who they were and the reason why they'd done what they'd done and why they were in there. Well, none of them would believe them, and they couldn't get back out again. And their average stay was 19 days before they could get out. That's nearly 3 weeks. And one of them was forced to stay 52 days before he could get out, so nearly 2 months. So if clinical assessment was objective, the clinician should have known straight away that they were, because they should have been able to check their boxes and go, oh no, you're just pulling my leg. They should have known definitively, but they don't. I mean, these people either had schizophrenia or they didn't. Why couldn't they tell? So the second experiment I'll just read this one out. In an experiment by Yale psychologists Abel and Langer, a video of an ordinary man being interviewed about work was shown to psychotherapists. Half the therapists were told the interviewee was a job applicant, whilst the other half were told he was a patient. The therapists themselves came from different training backgrounds. Half were from a more traditional background, and half had been specifically trained to avoid the use of labels. Abel and Langer found that when the man was called a job applicant, both groups of therapists tended to see him as a well-adjusted individual. When he was labelled a patient, the therapists trained to avoid the use of labels continued to see him as well-adjusted. However, many of the other traditionally trained therapists saw him as having serious psychological problems. Here you have two groups of supposed professionals diagnosing this person completely differently just based upon believing that the person was either a patient or a job applicant. So they have cognitive biases. They're not immune to it. So the clinical assessment is way more comprehensive than the AQ test. For that reason, it's supposedly that this allows clinicians to be able to, with pinpoint accuracy, work out whether you're autistic or not. But the problem is all this subjectivity that comes into it. On the AQ test, it's your own personal subjectivity is the only problem. Whereas with the clinical assessment, you have the subjectivity of the parent or primary caregiver assessing their own child, and then you have the subjectivity of the clinician, and not only one clinician, the whole team of them. So when they're check marking their boxes and all that, their cognitive biases will influence which box they check. So unlike with the AQ test does not have a definitive line. So when you score over this line, yep, you definitely have autism. Well, with the clinical assessment, I don't know exactly how they're scoring it, but they have to have a line somewhere, because when you walk out of that clinic, they have to be able to say to you, yes, you're autistic or you're not. When they score you, they'll add it all up, however they do, and come out with a score at the end of it and say, yep, that's over the line, so this person's autistic. Now, it's fine if you score way over the line, they're fine. But if you're borderline, or you just score over the line just a little bit, well, they've got to sit around and have a discussion. They've got to argue back and forth and debate, and that, is this person autistic or not? Now, that opens it up to subjectivity again, because the people with the stronger personalities, or the ones that are perceived to be more the experts, well, what they say will more greatly influence where that line's going. And then also cultural differences. Depending upon the cultural backgrounds of each one of the clinicians, that will influence where they are assessing. Because behaviours that are considered autistic in one country are actually considered desirable behaviours in another, and therefore not autistic. So after all that subjectivity, you come out of there and they've said, yep, you're autistic. So you can walk out of that clinic, go down the road to another clinic, get their assessment, and come out of there with them saying, no, you're not autistic. I mean, either you are or you ain't. Either you've got this entity inside you called autism, or you haven't. So now you can go back to the original clinic and you can walk in and say to them, oh, look, I'm sorry, but when we're doing the assessment, I forgot to tell you that I'm actually from such and such a culture. Is that relevant? And they'll go, really? You speak English so well? And you say, well, yeah, I had an English tutor when I was a child, so I speak it fluently. And they'll go, oh, well, okay. And they'll get back and they'll check all the scores, and they'll come back and they'll go, well, actually, you're not autistic after all. Either you've got this thing called autism or you haven't. Just your admission that you're from another culture doesn't just turn off the autism switch inside you. I mean, this is absolute lunacy as far as I'm concerned. I mean, so their susceptibility to subjectivity is clearly illustrated in the misdiagnosis rates. Now, you'll get a lot of different rates on different sites, but like for schizoaffective disorder, 75% misdiagnosis rate. For major depressive disorder, 55%. For schizophrenia, 23%. For bipolar, up to 92% misdiagnosis rate. Panic disorder, 85%. General anxiety disorder, 71%. social anxiety disorder, 97%. Autism, for children, 30% misdiagnosis rate. For women, 80% misdiagnosis rate. ADHD, 20% misdiagnosis rate. I mean, if you were a mechanic and you had a misdiagnosis rate on car problems of up to 92%, 97%, you'd be out of business before you knew it. So how do these people still have the power to label people with labels that change people's lives, and more times than not for the worse? It just blows my mind that these people have this level of power. What I'm trying to point out with all this is that this thing that causes us to be different is not a quantifiable entity. They're trying to put a box around this thing and definable edges on this thing that doesn't have definable edges. I'm just challenging the idea that autism is some entity that you can possess inside yourself. So you can stand two people side by side and say this person inside has this entity called autism inside them and this person does not. And that comes out in the wording when people say, I have autism. They're saying, I possess this thing called autism. And I challenge that. So what I'm trying to expose here is best described as one of the most insidious shell games that has ever been played. But like a magician's sleight of hand, I can only explain it so far. And then that last final step, a switch has to go on inside your mind where all of a sudden you go, I see it. And then once you see it, you can never unsee it. At first glance, it's easy to have the perception that somebody that's been labelled autistic has something completely different going on inside them than the rest of the population has. But there's an illusion going on here. And that perception of difference is actually an illusion. And at first you're going to be saying, what are you, nuts? Of course they're different. But it's very clever how they've done this. And to me, it's an actual crime, because one of the greatest challenges of being labelled autistic, and even without the label it's bad enough, is that feeling of separateness, that feelings of difference. And I believe eventually it'll go down in history, the act of mental health labels, not just autism, but all the others as well, that it'll go down as another tragic chapter in the history of psychiatry, eclipsing even that of the act of lobotomy. So let's just put aside the subjectivity of the diagnostic process itself for now, and as tragic as it is. What about the diagnostic criteria itself in the DSM? How does that get there? I mean, surely that's objective, right? Well, I'll just read this out. The content of the diagnostic and statistic for mental disorders is determined through a comprehensive and collaborative process involving mental health professionals from around the world. The American Psychiatric Association assembles panels of experts, including psychiatrists, psychologists, and other mental health professionals, to review and update the DSM. These panels review the latest research and clinical evidence to determine which disorders should be included, modified, or removed. They consider factors such as prevalence, diagnostic criteria, and the impact on treatment. So effectively, all these experts are sitting around having a discussion, debate, arguing backwards and forth until they finally come to a consensus over however many days it takes as to what goes in the DSM. So that just comes down to what goes in the DSM is based upon their opinion. Now they might claim it's their expert opinion, but still just an opinion, and an opinion is just a guess. So they're reviewing the research, and as we've already shown, for all the research they've done on autism, they still don't know what causes it, and they still don't even know what it actually is, other than it's something that affects neurodevelopmental stages. So, and then they're reviewing the evidence, and as we've shown there, evidence is not proof. Evidence is just a clue that something may be true. So what's going in the DSM is determined by their opinion of what the research that's never shown anything as far as conclusively, and the evidence that is only just a suggestion that something may be so. So the massive amount of subjectivity that could be distorting what goes in the DSM is absolutely off the charts. There is no, because there's no biomarkers or anything, there's no tangible data to show that this thing that they've called autism even actually exists in reality other than in their own minds. This box they create that they try to put people that they label as autistic into, those edges of the box don't exist in nature. It only exists in their minds. That's why every year this dividing line where normal behaviour stops and autistic behaviour is supposed to start, it keeps moving here, there and everywhere because it doesn't exist. It only exists in their minds. As their minds change, so too does the line. It's madness. So look at it this way. For a clinician to be able to decide if a person has a mental disorder or not, they have to consult the DSM. Now, to work out what criteria to put in the DSM, you have to be able to study people that have been diagnosed with that disorder. So this sets up a chicken and egg dilemma. Which came first? Because both rely on the other for its existence. So if you keep tracking back, right back to the first person that was ever diagnosed with a mental disorder, you have to ask, how were they diagnosed? Because there could be no criteria in existence to make that diagnosis, because before that first person was diagnosed, there was nobody to study to create a criteria. So the first person diagnosed as a disorder came into existence because a person made a subjective decision in their head that behaviour was different to that behaviour, and because that behaviour there is more common, that must be therefore normal, and this behaviour must therefore not be normal, so we'll call it a disorder and assume that there is something broken, something wrong in that person as compared to that person. And that's how the first diagnosis came about. And now the whole mental health establishment as we know it today is built upon this subjective assumption that these people that behave differently to the rest of society are broken in some way. But there's no physical evidence to prove that these people are broken. It's just observable observations of behaviour and the opinion of the clinician that this person is somehow broken in some way. So the term autism was first used in 1911, and it wasn't until 1943 that a guy called Leo Kanner determined that, no, that is something different to that, and said autism was separate from schizophrenia. So he came to that conclusion through the careful observation and analysis of children he studied. So he came to that determination due to his subjective observation of behaviour. So through his subjective observation of behaviour, he created another disorder. That's how autism came into existence as a separate disorder, because he created it. And it is based on the assumption, those behaviours, because they are so different to what is assumed to be normal behaviour, that must therefore be not normal behaviour and is therefore a disorder. So the assumption is that there is something broken inside these people that causes them to behave differently to those people. And that's how all these disorders have come about when you go right back to it. They're first, as a disorder, are created in the minds of the person that's doing the observing. These separate boxes that they have for all these disorders, they don't exist in nature. You don't have these separate boxes in people's heads where they have these comorbidities where they have one section is autism, one section is schizophrenia, one section is bipolar. They don't exist as these separate entities, which this act of labelling mental disorders creates that illusion. And while they hang on to that illusion, they will never understand what these things are and what causes them. Because even though they've compartmentalised the brain is not compartmentalised. It is one organism that works in synergy. The whole thing is based upon an assumption of the existence of a disorder as being something broken, something wrong inside a person. So I've come over to the whiteboard, guys, just to explain this last little bit. Now, like I say, it's like trying to explain a magician's sleight of hand. I can only explain it so far, but that switch has to go, just click on your head for you to be able to see it, where you go, now I understand what this guy's on about. So I'm hoping this bit will do it for you if it hasn't already happened for you. So what I've created here is a scale of 0 to 50. Sorry it's a little bit messy because this is like take 10 on doing this video, so I've been drawing all over it all afternoon. So this scale represents the clinical assessment. So however, I don't know exactly what scale they're using, how it's numbered or whatever, but just for demonstration purposes we'll use this. Now somewhere in that scale they've got a line drawn where if you score 31 you're considered not autistic, if you score 32 you are considered autistic. There has to be, because they definitively tell you when you leave, yes you're autistic or not. They don't ever sit down and say, well, we're not really sure. Doesn't happen. So this line does not exist in nature. There's no blood test you can do or no scan you can take that works out where this line is. So this line is the creation, and it only exists in the heads of the people that decide what goes in the DSM. Now they sit around and they all argue back and forth. Some say, oh no, it should be down here at 30, and some say, no, it should be up here at 35, and back and forth they go until finally they come to a consensus and they decide, okay, it's here between 31 and 32, wherever it is they decide it is. And then from there they say, okay, everything from 32 and above is the autism spectrum. Now between this line and this designation of this being the autism spectrum, they create the illusion that people who score up here have some sort of entity inside of them that people down here do not have. And that is absolute bullshit. When you take away this line that does not exist, what you end up with is an actual spectrum of behaviour that spans the whole of society. Because what they are measuring when they do the clinical assessment is they are measuring your behaviour. And there are no behaviours that autistic people exhibit that are not found down in the general population. So there's a guy called Simon Baron-Cohen, and he created the autism quotient test, and that's a recognised test by the psychiatric community, in that if you go to the doctor and say, oh, I suspect I might be autistic, he gives you that test to do, and then they'll just, depending on your score, they decide whether you should get a clinical assessment. So Simon Baron-Cohen, he also created the empathising quotient test and the systemising quotient test. Now, he has a theory that there are two types of cognitive styles, the empathising and the systemising. Now, it's just a theory, but I've chosen to take his theory on as a belief because it aligns so perfectly with my experience of life. And his theory is part of how I define who I am. So basically, he says that everybody has a mixture of empathising and systemising. So when they're measuring behaviour, I believe what they are actually measuring when they're assessing your behaviour is the ratio of systemising to empathising cognitive style that you have. Down here at 0, if you score a 0, you have 100% empathising cognitive style, and up here at 50 you would have 100% systemising. Now, do I think there are any people that would be either at that extreme? I doubt it, but if they are, they'd be very rare on the earth. Now, as you move up the scale, you're actually shifting your system into a systemising cognitive style by 2% increments. So here at number 1 you would have 98% empathising, 2% systemising. Then next increment you'd be 96 and 4, then next increment 94 and 6, and so forth. Until you get up to here at 16, where you'd be 32% systemising and 68% empathising. According to the AQ test, that's where the bulk of people score, is around this area. So the bulk of the population would score here. So basically, most of society is twice as much empathising as systemising. Now, when you get up here to 31, this person has a 62% systemising and a 38% empathising. So by the time you get to 31, it's almost reversed. You're almost twice as much systemising as empathising. And then when you get to 32, you have 64% systemising and 36% empathising. So this is what the criminal bastards have done. By drawing this line here, they create this illusion that this person at 32 has this entity inside of them that the rest of the population does not. But in fact, the only difference between someone at 32 and 31 is a 2% rise in a systemising cognitive style. That's all the difference is. So this illusion is perpetuated is that because the bulk of society is down around here, the bulk of the society is looking up here, the people are scoring up here, and they seem vastly different because these guys are two-thirds empathising, and up here, by the time you're up here, you're three-quarters. Like I'm up here at 34, so I'm 68% and 32%. So I'm more than two-thirds systemising. So I'm the complete opposite to this guy. So him viewing me, I seem vastly different. So that's part of the illusion. And that's why for us, we feel that alien feeling, because I think down around about here is 50-50. So anybody below this point is more empathising. So whenever we meet anybody below this point, they seem different to us. Now 80% of the population or more exists down here. So that means 9 out of 10 people that we meet seem vastly different to us. So that maintains that illusion that we are like from another planet or something. So when that Leo Kenner was studying those children, and he in his mind decided that these people are different. Well, in his mind, he created a line. Now, he would have been looking at children that were up at the extreme end. So, and him probably being Mr. Average would have been down here. So he would have been looking up there, and they would have seemed vastly different to him, almost alien-like. The further apart the observer is from where the person scores up here, the greater the difference is perceived. So someone down here viewing someone like there, it's like, yeah, that person is definitely from another planet. So he only observed two behaviours, main behaviours in children, was at the time was their desire for aloneness and their desire for sameness in everything. So as they continue studies after he initially decided that these people had a disorder, because once you become more predominantly systemising, then you start having difficulties navigating through life, because that's your cognitive style is your navigation system through life. And people with an empathising cognitive style, they navigate through life through emotion and empathy. That's how they move through. For those who are predominantly systemising, we navigate through life through patterns and systems and so forth. So the world, because the bulk of the population is down here predominantly empathising, the world has been built for them, and the world operates on empathising. So once you become predominantly systemising, you have difficulties operating in life. So that's what these guys have done. They've perceived this difference, and then they've seen the difficulties that we experience and decided in their minds that therefore there must be something wrong and something broken inside that person that we need to fix. And since that point, they've studied us like lab rats. Now, as they observe more and more behaviours, this line has steadily moved down the scale until where it is today. They're not discovering these behaviours that are autistic. They're just slowly moving down this scale, and it won't stop there because this line is not a real line. It doesn't exist. There is no separation line in nature on this scale. They will steadily keep moving down here, and there is actually major criticisms of their over the pathologization of disorders, in that normal grief now, and they've decided if you grieve more than so many days after somebody died, then you have some sort of obsessive grief disorder or whatever they call it. If you're a child that chucks too many tantrums, you now have some sort of tantrum disorder. They're just out of control. But if you want to maintain this illusion that this is vastly different from this, you have to make this section here disappear. Because as I say, as long as you're down here comparing to that, the illusion is easy to maintain that that is something entirely different. But if you're like me, somebody that's like me, and you compare this person to this person, the illusion disappears. You see it instantly for what it is. You see that it's all bullshit. So to keep this maintained, they have to make this section of people disappear. Now this section of people are millions and millions of people. So how do you make them disappear? Well, it's quite ingenious actually, and quite simple. What you do is you call it ADHD, and now you've made that section disappear. Now you can't compare that to that, because as they tell you, ADHD is not autism, but it has very similar traits, and that if you're not careful, you can misdiagnose it. Well done. Very well done. So now you can only compare this person to this person, and then when you compare that to that, you perceive that difference. So guys, I know it's been a long video, but the point is, that is why I will never ever allow them to do a clinical assessment on me. I will not allow neurotypical people that have put themselves in a position of arrogance, where they put themselves above me, and they worship a Bible called the DSM that designates me as having something broken inside, that there's something wrong with me that they need to fix. So it'll never happen. I choose to define myself, who I am. Now I've created what I call the ultimate divergence theory of autism, and unlike their model of autism, which is disempowering, it's a box, it's a cage, it imprisons you. My theory of autism, the ultimate divergence theory of autism, is an empowering one. And so I'll put the link below this video to that blog post. And it's basically a combination of theories like Simon Baron-Cohen's theory of systemizing, empathizing, the idea of neural divergence. It all wraps it all up into one that explains it all, not just the challenges of being on the spectrum, but it also explains the amazing abilities that many autistic people display. So check it out, guys. It'll open your eyes. So I'll leave it there. This has been too long, this video, and for you guys that are still here with me, you're absolute legends. So thank you for that, and I'll see you in the next video.